The fracture of hearts. Bleak Hollow, a name that dripped with the essence of despair, a city shrouded in shadows, where whispers of lost souls danced on the chill winds, carrying with them the murmur of forgotten voices, whispers that clawed at the edges of sanity. What began as a simple side quest, an idle curiosity on the part of Crag, had twisted and warped into something much darker, much deeper. Crag, Kosros, and Sly had ventured to this place, this abandoned remnant of Fairguard distant past, drawn by a name scrawled on a faded map, a past that told a potential future to come. But as they crossed into the ghostly ruins of CrystalGale, they were unaware that they stepped into a realm tainted by the endless of horror, a deity of unfathomable malevolence that hungered to return to the mortal world once more. A city poisoned by the tendrils of an ancient, grotesque fear, the endless of horror. This place was once vibrant, a jewel among cities, but now it stood hollow, echoing with the remnants of a forgotten life. A tainted city corrupted not by mere mortals, but by the apostles of the endless of horror, servants not yet full deities, but terrifying shadows of what could be. These apostles, twisted avatars, embodying tainted reflections of mortal sins, greed, gluttony, wrath, lust, and sloth, all twisted under the banner of two other endless, temptation and corruption. These apostles had ravaged Bleak Hollow with their insidious presence, staining it with a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the very light from the air. A perverse carnival of grotesque indulgence, where reality itself bent and twisted in their grasp. Crag, Kosros, and Sly, with their hearts intertwined by the bonds of friendship and shared suffering, found themselves confronting this darkness. Sly, their comrade, had joined briefly but was called away, leaving them alone against a force far beyond what they had imagined. They faced the Apostle of Sloth, a monstrous manifestation of apathy that drained the life from the very air, its mere presence sapping the will to move, to act, to survive, a creature that turned a bustling resort into a deadened mausoleum, where laughter was a distant memory and despair lingered like a thick fog. Crag and Kosros fought valiantly, rescuing as many souls as they could from the crumbling remains of Sloth's lair, even as the building itself seemed to conspire against them. Beams crashing down, ceilings collapsing. Crag, always the hero, always the protector, was caught under the crushing weight of falling debris, not once, but twice, testing the limits of his endurance and resolve. Sloth was a different beast entirely. The Apostle of Sloth did not rage, did not yearn, did not hunger. It simply waited, languid and uncaring, in the depths of an illusory resort where time melted like candle wax. Its power grew not through action, but through inaction, a slow erosion of will and purpose. Its present a facade gleaming in deceptive opulence, a sanctuary promising rest and respite, a cruel mirage in this wasteland of despair. Inside, the air was heavy with a narcotic lullaby, sweet and seductive, wrapping around them like a shroud. Walls dripped with gold, chandeliers sparkled like stars fallen to earth, but beneath this gilded surface lay something rotten, something that crawled and whispered from beneath the plaster, a decay unseen but felt deep in the bones. Rest, weary souls, rest, surrender. The words flowed like a river of honey, laced with poison. Time became elastic, stretching into an eternity of nothingness. Days passed like moments, hours like years. Each breath felt heavy, a struggle against the thickening air. Their minds began to fog, their purpose blurred by the seductive promise of rest. Crag and Kosros rushed into the collapsing building, tearing through debris to save as many innocents as they could. But Sloth was there, a specter of slow death that seemed to smirk with every second lost. Crag became trapped beneath a massive beam, his limbs already trembling with the strain of too many exertions, his skin pale with the marks of exhaustion. Kosros fought fiercely to save him, dragging Crag out once, twice, only for another part of the building to collapse. A splintered wooden beam slammed down, pinning Crag again, this time with no chance of escape. Crag struggled, teeth gritted, his hands trembling as he tried to pry himself free. Each effort drained him further, his breath growing shallow, his heart pounding in his ears. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning wood. Crag, every will spent trying to save those around him, but he couldn't even save himself. Exhaustion sank its claws deep into Crag's flesh. His body, broken and battered, teetered on the edge of death. Crag's eyes began to dim, his voice a ragged whisper, barely more than a breath. "Kosros, help me!" Kosros could only watch, helpless, as the light in his friend's eyes began to fade, as the darkness crept in, slow and inexorable. A battle erupted, the ground shook, and the Apostle of Sloth emerged in its true form, a mass of sinew and shadow that crawled forth from the depths. Kosros fought valiantly against the creature of sloth, but the weight of exhaustion had become too much for Crag. With each breath, the life force of Crag was slipping away, and even as Kosros managed to drag him free again, Crag succumbed, slipping into the cold grip of unconsciousness. His body went limp, and his breaths were shallow. In those moments, as Crag's life hung by a thread, the fates intervened. Kosros felt the weight of their deal, made sessions ago, felt the sharp, cold grip of inevitability take hold. Every roll was a failure. Every chance of salvation crumbled like dust between his fingers. Crag was dying. Kosros, ever the stalwart companion, fought to free him. But the fates, those cruel, fickle arbiters of destiny, intervened. The curse of the critical failures loomed large. The deal Kosros had struck to save a friend in desperation long ago, with the fates coming back to haunt him now. Every swing of his blade, every burst of his magic, turned to dust in the air, a parody of power in the face of an enemy that seemed almost amused by his attempts. And then, Crag died. In that harrowing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Kosros, his heart breaking, watched as the light dimmed in Crag's eyes. But even in death, Crag's spirit resonated, a pulse of profound sadness that echoed through the lands. Hearts grew heavy, clouds darkened, and a freezing rain began to fall, as if the very heavens wept for the loss of a soul so fiercely bound to the world. Kosros fought to protect Crag's body, to stave off the horror that crept ever closer. But then, darkness. Kosros screamed in rage and pain. A guttural sound ripped from his throat, a sound that was barely human. All around him, the land itself seemed to mourn. The skies darkened, and a cold rain began to fall, each dropping a mournful tear from the heavens above. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the earth seemed to quake with his despair. Crag's death echoed like a thunderclap through the hearts of all those who loved him, an energy that seemed to have brought in weakness to those who loved Crag and strength to the horrors that laid in the dark, a darkness that seemed to crawl up from the very earth itself, tendrils of black sludge wrapping around Crag's lifeless form. Kosros knew this was no mere death. This was a theft, a claiming of a soul by something far more sinister than even death itself dared to touch. The endless of horror laughed in the shadows, its voice 1,000 screams lost in the void, mocking Kosros, taunting him with every drop of despair. From the depths of shadow a presence stirred, a suffocating weight that pressed against the very fabric of reality. The endless of horror awakened, Its tendrils, black as pitch and cold as death, slithered from the corners of the room, wrapping around Crag's limp form like a lover's embrace turned deadly. Kosros reached out, his fingers grasping at air, at nothing. His scream was a sound ripped from the depths of his soul, a raw animal cry that echoed through the burning ruins. Cries felt across space and time. But it was too late. The tendrils tightened, pulling Crag into the darkness, into the void. "No," Kosros roared, his voice breaking under the weight of his grief. "No, bring him back." But the endless of horror only laughed, a sound like 1,000 screams merging into one, a sound that clawed at the mind, that sank deep into the marrow. And then, Crag was gone, consumed, and then the unthinkable, Crag's choice. Somewhere, between the realms of life and death, Crag stood alone, his soul drawn into an abyss darker than any night, facing two figures who seemed to wear human forms but were anything but human. The endless of temptation and corruption, those who served the endless of horror but offered themselves as mere lawyers, guardians of the terms of a dark pact. They promised salvation, power, a chance to save Kosros themselves, endless of horror that Crag has sympathized with, and all the souls that have been lost, their eyes gleaming with the promise of power, and their voices like silk across a razor's edge. The contract was simple, a pledge, a word, a single utterance of allegiance to the endless of horror. Crag, always the empathetic one, always the one who sought to find light, even in the deepest darkness, had been tempted before by the thought of saving the endless of horror, of changing its very nature, of turning it towards some distant rebirth. Where Kosros saw a demon to be locked away, Crag saw a creature that had once been abandoned, mistreated, misunderstood. A thing that was horror itself, yes, but also a thing capable of pain, loneliness, and maybe even redemption. He had seen the backstory, how the endless of horror was a creation of the endless of memories, how it had been trapped, abandoned, cast aside by its kin, and how its fury was not evil but born of pain, neglect, and fear. Crag only had to pledge allegiance to the endless of horror. The words were vague, open to interpretation, and in return, Crag would be reborn, given unimaginable power, a power that could even save those he loved, including Kosros. There was risk, yes, the potential for corruption, the possibility that he would fall into darkness, that he might lose himself to the very horror he wished to redeem. But in that moment, in that liminal space between life and death, Crag took the pen, dipped it in his own blood, and signed. He spoke the words. The darkness laughed and embraced him like a long-lost child. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, Crag signed in his own blood, uttering the words that would change the course of fate forever. I pledge allegiance to the endless of horror. Meanwhile, Kosros fought alone, his heart heavy with grief and despair, battling not just the Apostle of Sloth, but the very darkness itself. He could feel the endless of horror's whispers clawing at his mind, urging him to surrender, to give in, to end it all. The sadness that radiated from Crag's death weighed on him like a shroud. His health, his very will to fight, was being sapped away with every passing moment. Every strike he made was met with mockery from the endless void that encircled him. He was close to giving up, ready to let the dark embrace take him, to let the endless pain consume him whole. Rebirth and rage, the emergence of Regal. But then something happened that shattered the reality around them. Crag returned, but the old Crag seemed to be no more. From the ashes of his former self rose a new being, Regal, a dark dragonborn warlock cloaked in shadow and flame. His eyes burned with an intensity that was alien, his stance rigid, predatory. Crag was no more. Only Regal remained. A new name, a new face, but a familiar soul twisted by the pact he had made. Regal wasted no time. With the fury of a tempest, he unleashed an eldritch smite with Fury Blast, a bolt of darkness that tore through the Apostle of Sloth, like a scythe through wheat. He wielded his new powers like a master, cutting down his enemies with a savage grace, killing the beast with a single word. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. And for a moment, even Kosros was stunned by the transformation. The Apostle of Sloth was obliterated in a flash of dark energy, its essence shattered into 1,000 fragments. The ground quaked, and the air itself seemed to wail in agony as the entity was torn asunder. Regal's eyes burned with an otherworldly fire, a tempest of power and fury. Eldritch energies crackled around him, spiraling from his fingertips like serpents of dark light. The very air seemed to bend around him, distorted by the force of his presence. Without a word, he unleashed his fury upon Sloth, unlike any violence that Kosros had seen from Crag on purpose in the past. Kosros, watching this transformation, could barely comprehend what he saw. What is this strange person, thing, evil, before him, his friend? Could it be his ally, his once brother in arms, now a creature of power, of evil, perhaps even a weapon forged by the endless of horror itself? Was this still Crag? Could he trust him? Could he forgive him? But this victory was hollow. Regal stood before Kosros, his form flickering back and forth between the being he had become and the one he used to be. He spoke, but his words were foreign, his tone alien. Kosros stared at him, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. He sensed the dark energy radiating from this thing, the corruption that clung to him like a second skin. He could feel the taint of the endless of horror coursing through what claimed to know him, what claimed to once be his closest ally. "Who are you?" Kosros demanded, his voice raw and trembling. "A friend," the figure replied, a smile twisting at his lips, cold and cruel. "What do you want?" Kosros demanded, his voice raw and trembling. Regal's smile widened, a sinister twist that sent shivers through Kosros' spine. "Money, gold, wealth, power, and control. I want it all." The exchange between them was tense, every word a knife, every glance a wound. Regal did not speak like Crag, he did not look like Crag, and though the familiar form returned eventually, the stain of the decision remained. Kosros turned away, unable to bear the sight, the betrayal, the loss. The endless of horror had won a battle, if not the war. "Don't do this," Regal said, and for the first time there was a tremor in his voice, a fracture in the cold, unyielding facade. "Don't turn your back on me." Regal transformed back to Crag, their former self. But the change in appearance did not change the actions that were committed, the words that were said, or the events that had transpired. Kosros' expression twisted into a grimace, a mask of pain and anger so fierce it could have shattered stone. "You fool," he whispered, his voice low, trembling with barely contained rage. "You blind, naive fool." "You turned your back on all of us the moment you signed that pact," Kosros snapped, stepping through his portal. "The moment you became this." He turned away, unable to bear the sight of his friend, his brother, who now seemed like a stranger. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. "I can't look at you," he muttered. "Not now, not like this." In a fit of rage, Kosros teleported away, leaving Crag alone in the ruins of Bleak Hollow. The darkness of the endless of horror still whispered in the shadows, laughing softly, savoring its victory. Crag, confused, hurt, and unsure of his own choices, returned to Heartland, but even there the effects of his death had spread like a cancer. The people of Heartland were mourning, their hearts heavy with the echo of his loss that they felt unsure where it came from. The city was weakened, vulnerable, the division between Crag and Kosros leaving it fractured and exposed. The fracturing of Heartland. A new path divides Heartland. A city already teetering on the brink of chaos, now trembled under the weight of these revelations. Crag's death had sent ripples of despair throughout the region, but his resurrection, in this new dark form, threatened to shatter the fragile peace that remained. Kosros returned to Heartland too, but he did not return as the man he was. His focus had shifted. No longer did he care for the politics of Fairguard or the dealings of Heartland's council. His mission was now singular: prevent any more seals from breaking, undo broken seals, find allies who could stand with him, and prepare for the final battle against the endless of horror. But he knew one thing above all else: he could not trust Crag. Crag, who had been his friend, his comrade, now felt like a stranger. Kosros could feel the darkness in Crag, could sense the shadow in his soul. His heart was heavy, his mind torn. How could he trust Crag now, knowing what he had done, knowing the deal he had struck? How could he allow this new, dark force to remain within his city, within his life? Their confrontation was explosive, words like thunder, each one a bolt that struck at the heart of their shared history. Trust had been severed, faith had been shattered. The divide between them was deep, a chasm filled with anger, fear, and betrayal. A crack formed in Kosros' heart and in the city itself. The two began to argue, their voices rising in anger and pain. Kosros accused Crag of betrayal, of making a selfish choice, of dooming them all. Crag, now back in his own form but forever changed, tried to explain, tried to justify his actions, but Kosros would not hear it. He could not see past the darkness that now shrouded Crag, could not forgive the betrayal he felt deep in his bones. The damage Crag might have done to those closest to them. At best, Crag was an unknowing agent. At worst, Crag was a knowing apostle of evil, and ally of horror. "You've damned us," Kosros yelled, his voice hoarse, cracking under the weight of his pain. "You've damned us all, Crag. You are an idiot, an utter moron." Crag's voice soft and caring. "I've given us a chance to save the endless of horror, to redeem it, a chance to fight back, to save us, to save all of them, to be more than we were. This power isn't yours," Kosros shouted, stepping closer, fists clenched, so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It was never yours to take. You've aligned yourself with the very darkness I swore to destroy. You've become its pawn, its puppet. You have threatened the very people we care about. For what? A chance that this thing, this grotesque monster will care? Will grow a heart? Grow up, Crag. That is not how life works. You have endangered us." Kosros' rage and disappointment continued. "To save them? Or to save yourself?" the voice taunted, echoing in the depths of Crag's mind. "Look at what you've done. Look at what you've lost. Or are you too much of an idiot to see it yet?" He could see it, feel it, the division he had sown, the fracture that had widened into a chasm. He felt the heart of Heartland pulse in pain, its people mourning his death, then recoiling in horror at his rebirth. The city itself seemed to tremble, its foundations shaken by the echo of his choices. The tension was palpable, the pain unbearable. Heartland stood on a knife's edge, its fate uncertain, its heroes divided. Crag believed he had made the right choice, had done what needed to be done, but Kosros could not accept it, could not forgive it. A rift had formed between them, one that might never be mended. Kosros' eyes narrowed, his breath catching in his throat, And what happens when it turns against you? What happens when you lose yourself, Crag? When there's nothing left of the man I knew, the friend I loved. Kosros, his resolve hardened by the pain of loss, vowed to spend every moment preparing for the final battle with the endless of horror. No more would he waste time on trivial matters, on lesser enemies, on distractions. He would find allies, recruit powerful warriors, prepare for the day when the endless broke free. But could he ever trust Crag again? Would Crag remain a friend? Or had he become something else entirely? Was their bond forever broken? Or was there a path back to the light? As they stood at opposite ends of their path, both knew that the endless of horror had won a victory that day. A victory not of power or force, but of hearts divided, of trust shattered, of bonds broken,